Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, donning this fabulous outfit once again, which can only mean one thing as far as I'm concerned, but it's time for another book review, or what I like to call another installment of Tess Hex versus Literature. No, I still haven't come up with a better title for that, so that's what the series is called, and it's sticking thusly. Right, so, the book in the firing line today is, well, I don't know how to introduce it, because in every review thus far, there's been a name that I've not been able to pronounce for the life of me. And I've got a two-thirds success rate so far, because I completely butchered Kovac's name in the Laputin Factor, but then I got Jeremiah Pym's name correct in The Man with Two Shadows, and according to Kevin Frayne, the author of Summerhill, the book I reviewed last time, I pronounced the character Shoa, and I pronounced her name correctly, or close enough, so in this case, the name is actually of the author. The book is Shipbreaker by Paolo Bacigalupi? I'm hoping I'm saying that right, because there you go. I have a very hit and miss success rate with pronouncing names, but yes. I have a bit of a weird story behind why I own this book, because, as I recall, if you'll humour this little anecdote, back in the day, back in my high school days, I believe it was. It may have been since then, I'm not sure. But if you know me, you know I had to travel around by public transport a lot. A lot. Seriously. And so I needed something to pass the time. The mind-numbing boredom, spent on a bus, it's absolutely... it's unbearable. So, investing in books and whatnot, that's how I ended up reading through... I believe that's how I ended up reading through, the two Ken Follett books that got adapted into TV series shortly thereafter, the Pillars of the Earth and World Without End, but that's a story for another time. And I ended up getting this book at some point. Now, I got it from a bookshop in Sweden, but the book is in English, so yeah. Plus, I don't think the author... I believe the author's actually American. I just happened to get it from a Swedish bookshop. And I read one chapter of it, and then abandoned it. I'm not sure why. I just read some of it and then stopped reading it. And it's taken me, 5 years to come back to and actually finish reading it? So, I actually have done now. I reread the first chapter as well, obviously. And, well, I should probably stop wasting time and just get to reading the back of the book as I do in these reviews. So, welcome to a world where oil is scarce, but loyalty is scarcer. Naylor's time is running out. He's getting too big for his work, stripping copper wire from old oil tankers, and once he's off the crew, he's on his own, stuck in a shack on the beach with no food, no money, and no way of earning his keep. He has one last chance. The thing all crew members dream about, a lucky strike, has hit in the shape of a clipper ship beached during the last hurricane. If he can hold off the rest of the scavengers long enough to get the oil out, he might just have a future. But oil's not the only thing on the ship, and what Naylor finds is going to change his life forever. I find that, having read the book, I find that to be a bit of a misleading blurb, because, the first half of that is accurate, but then it kind of goes a little bit clickbaity towards the end, because, slight spoiler, but the thing that he finds on the ship that changes his life forever, first of all, he doesn't even go after the oil in the first place, but he does find one of the other main protagonists of this book. You just don't know she's a protagonist until she appears on the ship. I'm not really sure where to begin analysing this book. This has got nothing to do with the fact that it's distinctly non-furry. It just happens to be the first non-furry book that I've reviewed, and it doesn't quite leave the same impression as the ones that I've reviewed up to this point. First of all, reading through it, I'm very aware that I'm reading a piece of what would be described as young adult fiction. It seems very much geared towards mid-teenage, perhaps a little bit later. The sort of age where you're young, but you probably think you know better than you do. I don't know. It's not patronising, but it does seem very young adult fiction. And in case you didn't interpret from the blurb, it's one of these not quite post-apocalyptic, but set about 20 minutes into the future where the whole world has gone to hell. They refer to what is the present day for us here now as the accelerated age, and there's this kind of ongoing commentary of, the people in the accelerated age were so irresponsible, oh my god, they used to have petrol-based cars that drove around on roads, oh my god, it's all boats that can fly through the air now. It's not steampunk, it's definitely not that, it's just generally ecological disaster slash I don't know, dystopian future, sort of. The main idea here is the main character, along with the rest of his whole community, they work on a beach called Bright Sands Beach, where there are a load of washed up, destroyed ships from the Accelerated Age, as they call it, that are a load of old oil tankers, and what they do is they send what they call the light crew, on which Naylor works, the main character. They go in, they strip out the copper wiring, all of the other scavengeable stuff, and then sell it on for, well, I say a profit. They don't get much money. The idea is our main character lives in poverty, and that's how they get work. They risk their lives getting stuff out of ships. That does bring me on to the idea of the notion of classism is a very strong point recurring throughout the book, because partway through the story, there's this introduction of a character called Nita, and she's from the other half, as it were, because there are the people who work on the ships, the titular ship breakers, as it were, who, you know, they're the lower classes, the working classes. It's not to say that class determines where they should work, but rather the lives they're born into are kind of indicative of the class. It's not like, oh, I don't like your face, you're going to go and work on a ship. It's just they happen to be born in the right place to work on, you know, breaking ships. And then there's people like Nita, who are the people who live in the cities that survived this, not apocalypse, but whatever disaster it was that, well, probably the ice caps melting and, you know, the whole climate change, global warming, all that stuff. The people who survived that and aren't any worse off. Now, they're referred to throughout the book as swanks, and this notion of swank versus, I forget what it's a two-way thing, because the people who live in poverty have that as a condescending term for the people who are slightly better off, and the better off people have well-meaning but still condescending nicknames for the people who work breaking ships. It seems to be very much written from the perspective of all swanks are automatically bad guys just because they happen to be born living wealthily, and the fact that Nita, who is constantly referred to as the swank, or, well, because she's the upper class character who has the most interaction with the lower class ones, it's told from a perspective where we're supposed to sympathize with the other main characters who are of lower social class. We're supposed to agree with them and, you know, just have it ingrained into us that, yes, the rich people must be the bad guys because these poor people exist. And in reality, that's kind of not how class systems work. I'm not by any means saying, oh no, the rich people must be defended, oh my goodness, the rich people... No, what I'm trying to say is the book portrays it as rich people are automatically the bad guys, no exceptions. Money automatically makes you bad, and because you're working class, you are the people, therefore you're the best. And money doesn't determine your moral inclination. But it just seems rather obvious where the author's political leanings lie, and I'm not trying to pick that apart, I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate to make that obvious here. I do find it to be a slight turn-off that the story does, well, at least the characters get fixated on this idea of, oh, you're better off, but you're having to live with us poor people, oh my, we're now, who's the powerful one now, because we're used to this and you're not, because you're a swank, you have everything handed to you on a silver platter, and that makes you a bad person because you totally chose that life. The fact that they get hung up on this so frequently is a bit of a turn-off, but that aside, one of the main characters is something of a recurring antagonist. I'm not going to spoil who that is, but they end up dying by the end of the book, and I feel as though pretty much the entire events, like everything that happens in this book, could just be avoided if that character were to be killed a lot sooner, like within the first 2 or 3 chapters, because there are 25 chapters in all, as I recall. If this recurring antagonist were to just die in the first couple, because he's introduced almost immediately, if he just dies sooner, if someone just kills him sooner, then the entire book just kind of wouldn't happen. I mean, the events would still happen, but not in the same way. So, you know, Naylor would still meet Nita, for instance, but they wouldn't... Like, it's hard to describe without spoiling too much, but the first half of the book or so takes place on Bright Sands Beach, this impoverished area. And then, after a while, Nita comes along. Naylor and Nita then catch a train illicitly. They're too poor to get the train legitimately, so they have to jump on board and risk their lives in doing so. And they take this train to the Orleans because that there was New Orleans and then New Orleans 2 and all these places that have been drowned. They call them the Drowned Cities, which is actually the title of the next book in the series. I believe it's a 2-part series, but anyway, they get the train up to whatever the current incarnation of New Orleans is at the time, and I forget the point that I'm making. What I'm trying to say is, the entire half, maybe 2/3 of the book up to that point, like, if this book were a film, 2/3 of this book would just be the opening 20 minutes to establish the scene. And so, I'm not entirely sure if that's a weakness or not, because it does feel like the book takes too long to set the scene and then finally get going. And honestly, when I was reading the first 6 or 7 chapters, I kept forgetting which characters were who. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a weakness of the writing, but I didn't feel as drawn in as I have done in some of the books I've read in the past. It's by no means a bad book, it's still entertaining, and I'm very much aware that my description of it kind of isn't brilliant, because I'm trying to not spoil too much, so you still have something to read if you want to go and read it. But I'm not as convinced by this book as I have been by some of the others that I've reviewed in the past. Anyway, I forget the point I was originally trying to make, but they end up taking a train to whatever Orleans, which, they end up living in the poor district while they're looking for a ship owned by Nita's father's company, because, as established, she's a swank, she's automatically bad or naive or worthless socially because she's worth money instead. And so, again, there's this idea that the characters keep getting hung up on, oh, you're of a higher class, therefore you're a bad person. And so they end up having to work as, they become errand boys. Now, I use that term just as an expression because, obviously, Nita's a girl, Nayla's a boy, and they end up doing odd jobs around Orleans for a couple of weeks so they can have enough money to stay alive whilst waiting for a ship to happen. And then a ship does happen, but they get separated, there's this huge naval battle, and then during that naval battle, this recurring antagonist, who has actually popped up several times prior to this, finally ends up dying, and then that naval battle just happens to dump them off back at Bright Sands Beach, where the whole story started, so they don't really go anywhere, they don't really learn anything, and, oh yeah, Nayla ends up falling in love with Nita. That feels really shoehorned. Please, don't do that. Just because there's a male character and a female character, they don't need to be in a relationship. It feels so forced because, especially in this case, because Nayla really resents Nita just because she happened to be born more fortunate than he was. And, as I said, they keep getting hung up on this. But at the same time, he eventually resents her so hard that it crosses the line twice and he falls in love with her. Like, no, that's kind of lazy pandery writing, if you ask me, but I'm not going to criticize too much, because as I said, it is still a good book. It is still something you can invest yourself in. It's just a bit harder to do so than some of the other ones that I've read. But then again, that may well be because this is explicitly young adult fiction as opposed to fiction. So I suppose it has to be a bit easier and a bit simpler in those terms. I don't know. Now, I would be interested in reading the next book. I do think it's just a 2-part series as far as I can tell, but the next one's called The Drowned Cities. And I want to read that just to see where it goes, because, as I said, this book as a whole feels like the first 45 minutes of a film or so. Like 2/3 of this book could be summed up in 20 minutes. Like, Nayla lives on Bright Sands Beach, he breaks ships for a living, and now there's a hurricane, then Nita appears, and now he's fucked off with Nita. 2/3 of the book covered in 20 seconds or 20 minutes of film. And so if you were to put that along with The Drowned Cities, I'm sure you could have a normal length film, but it would still probably be straight to DVD. I don't mean to sound really scathing, because I did still enjoy reading it, but I don't know, there's just something about the book that didn't quite resonate with me as much as some of the previous ones have. I still enjoyed it, though, don't get me wrong. I'd still give it a... I don't want to sound too harsh, but I'm going to say 6 out of 10. Because it's enjoyable, it is an enjoyable romp, but I do feel as though the romance is a little bit forced. They go on this journey that actually just leads them back to where they started, and they don't really learn anything. They get hung up on classism for much longer than they need to, and the whole thing with the journey up to Orleans and working in poverty for a couple of weeks and then coming back down as part of a naval battle, all of that could just be avoided if they just kill that recurring antagonist who's established in, chapter 2, I think? So does kind of feel a bit pointless. But it's still worth reading just to see how it goes, because I do recommend reading this book and judging for yourself. This is just the impressions that I got. I did start to feel a little bit lethargic reading through it. I eventually started reading through a chapter or two whilst making dinner, so I had something to do, because making dinner here is so boring. I do want to like this book, but when I talk about it, the only things that come to mind readily are these criticisms, but don't take that to mean that I didn't enjoy it, because I did, just not as much as some of the other books that I've read in the past. And all books have their weaknesses, but Shipbreaker does kind of have more prevalent weaknesses than some others that I've read. But I'd still be interested in seeing where this goes, and perhaps in a couple of months' time you can expect a review of The Drowned Cities if I can get a copy of it, because, I mean, I am going to be going to Stockholm in May of next year, so maybe I can find another branch of the bookstore, and maybe I can find another, find a sequel. There are bookstores here, maybe they sell it in this country, I don't know. I'll see if I can find the next book in the series. Maybe that'll change my view of the... Well, I say the series, there are only 2. Maybe it'll change my mind about the story. I don't know. It would work if the 2 were put together as a single film, but as I said, they spent too long setting the scene and too long obsessing over classism, and it sort of does seem a little bit like... It feels like the book wants to be neutral, but is so very, very heavily invested in like portraying the poor people as the automatic good guys just for the sake of being, even though the recurring antagonist is one of the quote poor people, he's still portrayed relatively more sympathetically than these rich people who have done nothing wrong. And that's kind of part of the issue I take, in that it's not as neutral as it wants to be. I don't know. I've made my opinions really clear, and I can only go so far without repeating myself, and, as I said, I enjoyed it. There are just some weaknesses, and those are the most noteworthy things I can bring up. So, I don't mean any offence. I do still recommend reading it, and I still gave it 6 out of 10. That's still, that's still in the upper half of what it could be. That's still the good side of meh. But, read it for yourself, see what you think. And so on that note, I have been and will continue to be Tessellating Hexagons, and, well, I'll see you the next time I review a book, unless you watch some of my other videos in the intervening time instead, which you could also do, but I'm rambling. See you next time.